Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association, and I welcome you to a presentation on With Fire and Sword, the bloody fight at Bunker Hill. We also welcome our fellow veterans who are viewing this presentation from the Edith Norse Rogers Memorial Veterans Hospital in Bedford, Massachusetts. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Jim Nelson. Jim Nelson was born and raised in Maine, and he graduated from UCLA's film school. Finding that despite being in Southern California, it was a damp, drizzly November in his soul. By the way, Jim wrote this, can you tell? Jim took the cure Melville recommended and decided to sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. For 6 years, he worked on board traditional sailing ships before launching a writing career in 1994. He has since written more than 25 works of maritime fiction and history. He's the winner of the American Library Association William Young Boyd Award and the Naval Order's Samuel Eliot Morrison Award. Nelson has lectured all over the country and appeared on the Discovery Channel, History Channel, National Geographic, and Book TV. He currently lives in Harpswell, Maine, with his former shipmate, now wife, Lisa, and 2 of their 4 children. Now we have signed book plates available for anyone who has bought Jim's book on Amazon or anywhere else. So be sure and collect your book plate after the program. And with that, again, thanking him for his patience, please welcome, coming from Harpswell, Maine on Zoom, Jim Nelson.
Well, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be with you, even if it is only virtually. I'm sorry I was not able to get down to give the talk in person. It's always nice to get down to your part of the world, which is just so rich in the history of the American Revolution and colonial America and so much else going on down there. You know, Maine is beautiful, but frankly, not an awful lot happened around here. So it's nice to get down to Massachusetts. Someone had asked me why I wrote With Fire and Sword. I am primarily consider myself a maritime writer of both fiction and nonfiction. With Fire and Sword is really about the only book that I've written that is not maritime oriented. And there are a couple of things that attracted me to the subject. One, Bunker Hill, in and of itself is a fascinating subject. And I think it's one of the few battles of the American Revolution that anyone has really heard of. I mean, present company excluded, I think probably for most Americans, Bunker Hill might be one of the few battles they could actually name, though I suspect that most Americans would be surprised to learn that we actually lost the Battle of Bunker Hill. People don't necessarily know an awful lot about it. The other thing that attracted me to the subject is I'm fascinated by those early days of the American Revolution, the formation of the revolution, how it came about, and sort of, how it developed into what it did. You really see by 1776 and the signing of the Declaration of Independence, it was pretty well established what we were fighting for. We were fighting for independence, and it was really just a matter of who was going to win, the British or the Americans. But in those early days, it was much, much more confused than that. There really wasn't even necessarily a sense for what we were fighting for. Some people were still hoping for a reconciliation with England. Some of the real radicals were understanding that it was going to be a fight for independence. Um, some people felt that it was the Parliament that was really oppressing the Americans and that King George really was on the side of his subjects. So much confusion, so much um, misunderstanding. And that's really reflected in the history of Bunker Hill. We're going to talk more about that, but you can really see um, that sort of ad hoc quality that the early days of the American Revolution had. Um, and one of the things that I find so very fascinating about it. So I want to talk a little bit about the lead up to Bunker Hill, and the sort of the formation of the revolution. It's one of the inherent problems with history, where we try to take something like, say, the Battle of Bunker Hill and look at it as an individual event. But of course, history doesn't work that way. It's all so intertwined. Everything that led up to that moment was so important in what happened during the battle. It's very, very hard to separate the one event out from everything that led up to it. So if you will indulge me, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the earlier events that led up to Bunker Hill. The playwright George Bernard Shaw said that the reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. Now, Shaw's quote is absolutely applicable to the situation in Massachusetts in 1775, where you had an awful lot of very unreasonable individuals on both sides who really were the prime drivers of events. Now, I'm going to say that the most reasonable man in this theater of operations at the time, the person I will give that award to, is this man, Thomas Gage, who was the commander in chief of troops in North America and the governor of Massachusetts. Now, you notice that the guy that I give the most reasonable award to is not an American. And it really kind of proves Shaw's observation. When you're writing history like this, and you're really delving into the different individuals who played such key roles, and you're reading correspondence, you're reading journals, you're reading others' opinions of these people, you're seeing that the actions they undertook, you form a very strong opinion about them. And very often you come to really like or really dislike some of the characters in history. And I really came to very much like and respect Thomas Gage. I thought he was a man in trying to do the best possible thing in an absolutely impossible situation. And we'll see more about that. Now, Gage was 55 years old in 1775. He came from a long line of British aristocrats who had always managed to find themselves pretty much on the wrong side of history. His ancestors had stood with King John against the Magna Carta. They sided with Charles I in the English Civil War. Of course, Charles had his head cut off. After the Reformation, they remained Catholics and sided with Mary Queen of Scots, not a good move. Sir John Gage, again, Thomas Gage's ancestor, was actually Queen Elizabeth's jailer when she was locked up in the Tower of London. Luckily for him, when she finally took the throne, he had the good sense to die 2 years earlier, or else things might not have gone so well. Thomas Gage joined the army as a young man. He fought as a teenager. He fought in the War of the Austrian Succession and was later sent to America to fight in the French and Indian War. He participated in the Battle of Monongahela, where Braddock was ambushed on his way to Pittsburgh. Um, and it was an interesting battle. It was really kind of a who's who of people who would end up uh, playing very important roles in the American Revolution, including Thomas Gage, who was one of the few who managed to cover himself in glory. One of the others who actually performed very well in that disastrous battle was George Washington. And Gage and Washington actually became pretty close friends, and they corresponded over the years until the American Revolution, which, as you can imagine, kind of put a damper on that friendship. Um, during Gage's time, he married an American woman, Margaret Kemple. He was made commander in chief of all British forces in North America, and he moved to New York City, where he held that command for about 12 years. So he really, from the point that he had come over to fight in the French and Indian War, um, he never left America. Married an American woman, settled in New York. With this background, Gage probably had a better understanding, a more nuanced understanding of Americans and the situation in America than certainly any other British officer, and probably anyone in Parliament or in the administration. So, as a result, of course, because he had this deep knowledge, the politicians in London completely ignored anything he had to say about America, because invariably they knew best. Um, so by the late 1760s, while Gage was commander in chief in New York, things, of course, were getting increasingly tense in the American colonies. And you saw this series of events that tended to play out exactly the same way. The Parliament would impose taxes on the Americans. The Americans would rise up in arms and protest. The British, recognizing that this was, an issue, would back off their taxes, but still insist that they had the right to tax if they wanted to, and very often would leave one of their taxes in place, some minor tax, just to make it clear that from a legal standpoint, Parliament believed they did have the right to tax Americans. So this goes on repeatedly, for the decade of the 1760s, until finally in 1768, things are really starting to get tense in the epicenter of American resistance, which of course was Boston. That's where things really started to get, very heated. So in 1768, the British sent additional troops to Boston to try to suppress that spirit of rebellion that was clearly growing there. And that ends up creating kind of an interesting situation with the British troops in Boston, as we'll see after Lexington and Concord. Of course, for all of 1775 and 1776, Washington and the American army was trying to drive the British out of Boston. But the fact is that once it became clear that the revolution was going to be a continent wide conflict, the British didn't want to be in Boston. They wanted to be in New York, which was the logical place for the army to be based. But they couldn't leave because they were afraid they would be attacked if they did. And at the same time, the Americans were unaware that the British were trying to leave. So it's kind of funny, is I'm sure you folks know, imagine most people in this country don't, but in Boston, they still celebrate Evacuation Day on March 17th when the British do finally leave Boston. But the irony is that they didn't really want to be there at all. They wanted to leave the whole time. Anyway, despite the presence of additional troops in Boston and the tension that created, things were relatively calm from about 1770 to about 1773, in part because the economy was booming. And when the economy is doing well, people are making money, it's hard to sort of foment discontent. So things were relatively calm enough that Gage, as commander-in-chief, decided that he was going to go back to England again for the first time since he had come over to take part in the French and Indian War. So in 1773, he returns to England. While he's in England, things really explode in Boston with the Boston Tea Party. And the Americans, the Sons of Liberty, dressed as Indians for some reason, it's not like anyone actually mistook them for Indians, go aboard the three ships in Boston and dump the tea in the harbor as a protest, actually not against taxes on the tea, but on a monopoly that the Parliament had given to the British East India Company on the import of tea. It was, as is always the case with this sort of thing, it's much more complicated than the kind of shorthand version that most people know about what happened. In any event, this outrage takes place where the Americans dump the tea into Boston Harbor. Parliament immediately cracks down on Boston. They realize it's time to completely put down this this nascent rebellion. Now, the governor at the time was Francis Hutchinson. He had actually resigned his position prior to the Boston Tea Party, and the Parliament was looking for a replacement for Hutchinson who could take over as governor of Massachusetts. And they realized that they had the perfect man right in their midst, Thomas Gage. Gage, again, was more familiar with America than any other British officer. He'd been there for many, many years. He was a very competent, very well-respected man. Also, he had the added benefit of being commander-in-chief of the armed forces there. If a colonial governor, if a royal governor wanted to call up troops, they first had to get permission from the commander-in-chief, and the commander-in-chief had to send the men that they needed. So it was a sort of involved process. With Gage as governor, you bypass all of that because he's already commander-in-chief, so he can do whatever he wants with the troops. So they recognized that Gage was really the ideal man to take over as governor. They appoint him as governor of Massachusetts, and is continuing on as commander-in-chief. So Gage returns to America. He lands in Boston in May of 1775, the inauspicious day of Friday the 13th. And despite his very best efforts, things start going downhill very rapidly. The Boston Port Bill has shut down the city of Boston, throwing hundreds and hundreds of sailors out of work. And if there's one thing that you do not want, it is angry sailors with too much time on their hands roaming the streets. So that becomes a huge problem. The discontent, taking away Massachusetts charter is all creating an incredibly tense situation. So the Parliament has also moved the government from Boston to Salem, but none of the government officials dare leave Boston. So the official government, they can't even meet because nobody dares leave the confines of the city to go out there. So when Gage arrives to find this situation getting increasingly tense, the person who was his primary adversary, probably his chief nemesis, was someone who was as much responsible for starting the American Revolution probably as anyone else who could lay claim to that. Now, I think if you ask most people in the United States, okay, who in Massachusetts was the primary rabble rouser, the one who was really driving the revolution at this point, 1774, 1775, they would probably say it was John Adams. But that's not correct. John Adams was not really one of the driving forces at this point. It was, in fact, his cousin, Sam Adams. sorry, wrong Sam Adams. There he is. Now, Sam Adams is a very interesting guy. He is about as different from Thomas Gage as a human being could be, and he certainly is the um, the embodiment of Shaw's unreasonable man. Um, Sam Adams was someone who was willing to do whatever it took to keep the fires of revolution burning, even during those years of 1770 to 1773, when things were sort of settling down a bit. Now, Sam Adams was born in 1772. He was 52 in 1774. He had came from a wealthy family and had been largely a failure at pretty much everything that he set his hand to. He inherited a fairly large estate from his father, which he managed to squander. His father had a brewery, which Sam Adams took over and also drove into the ground. For a number of years, Sam Adams served as the tax collector in Boston, which was sort of a private job that one did for profit. And he ended up his tenure as tax collector owing the city of Boston £8,000. I don't know how you lose money as a tax collector. Since the days of Jesus, being a tax collector is a very lucrative career. But part of the problem with Adams is that he really loved his fellow citizens, and he couldn't necessarily bring himself to insist that they pay the taxes that they owed, which didn't do him any good, but it certainly endeared him to the people of Boston and set him up for his subsequent career. So it's not until the mid 1760s that Sam Adams, with the passage of the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, that Sam Adams finds his true calling, which is rabble rousing, and he was very good at it. With him was his closest associate. Now, okay, we have a live audience here. Does anyone know who this is?
Joseph Warren.
There we go. Okay. Now, again, I bet if I ask that question, and when I ask that question, almost any place else, nobody knows who he is. But this is Dr. Joseph Warren. At the time of the American Revolution, his was a household name. He was very, very famous, very well known. He later gets eclipsed by the other people, who continue on throughout the course of the war and make sort of a bigger name for themselves. But he was a very, very important and influential figure in these early days. And he was Sam Adams' close associate. The two of them were both Harvard graduates, but that's about the only similarity between them. Warren was 19 years younger than Adams. He was one of the finest doctors in Boston. He'd grown quite wealthy through his medical practice and through the old-fashioned means of marrying into money. He had 4 children and lived a very comfortable life. But despite that, he was absolutely devoted to the revolution, and he was one of the chief propagandists of the revolutionary cause. And he was really a demagogue by any description. When you read the sort of inflammatory prose that he was writing, it really is pretty amazing and very much over the top. Apparently, it was effective because he kept writing it. But for instance, like after Lexington and Concord, he writes, death and devastation are the instant consequences of delay. Every moment is infinitely precious. An hour lost may deluge your country in blood and entail perpetual slavery upon the few of your posterity who may survive the carnage. This is the sort of thing that he's writing. And it's interesting because Warren didn't really believe that himself. He knew Thomas Gage. He had a lot of association with Thomas Gage. He knew that Gage was not going to just slaughter everybody in Boston and enslave those few who lived. But he also knew how to fire up the crowd. And he wrote this sort of thing. And he, with Adams, kept this revolutionary spirit going for a long time, all through those early days leading up to the actual fighting. So again, as I said, things were really kind of falling apart in Massachusetts at this point, 1774, going into 1775. Um, the royal government couldn't meet because nobody dared go to Salem. Adams and John Hancock and Joseph Warren and a number of others had set up a parallel government, a provincial Congress that was actually running things and issuing orders to the city. So you actually had two governments operating at the same time, the American government and the official royal government. It was absolutely crazy. It was chaos. At the same time, Gage was getting letters from London insisting that he do something about this growing revolution, insisting that he just go out and crush these rebels. Um, the Earl of Dartmouth was the American secretary at the time, and he really had very little understanding of the situation on the ground. And he really felt that all Gage had to do was to go out, with his redcoats and just crush these farmers, these farmers under arms. Gage understood that that was not going to work. And he actually wrote to Dartmouth and he said, because Gage only had 3,000 men under his command at this point. And he writes to Dartmouth and he says that the 3,000 men rather encourages resistance rather than terrifies. He understood that the Americans were not afraid of 3,000 redcoats. And Gage told Dartmouth, if you want me to crush these people, I need at least 20,000 troops. And of course, the Parliament was aghast. That is a lot of money. 20,000 men? No, no, no. Come on, this is just a bunch of, farmers. Just go out and do that. So you have this ongoing tension where the Parliament is pushing Gage to just do something, and Gage understands that there is nothing that he can do. One of the things that Gage was very much afraid of was an explosion. He understood that he was sitting on a powder keg and that it was going to take very little for this whole thing to just blow up in his face. So one of the things that he would do was send columns of soldiers to march through the countryside just to acclimate the Americans to the presence of redcoats marching down country roads. So these columns would head out of Boston with flags flying. They'd be playing Yankee Doodle just to really annoy the Americans. And of course, the militia would turn out with their muskets and they would watch the redcoats. The redcoats would watch them, and the redcoats would march around and go back to Boston. And tense as it was, nothing happened. And Gage did this again and again to try to acclimate the Americans to the sight of redcoats marching. So on April 14th of 1775, Gage receives a letter from Dartmouth telling him that he has got to act. He has got to do something. Dartmouth calls the Americans a tumultuous rabble without any appearance of general conduct or without head to advise them or leaders to conduct them, that would render them formidable to a regular force led forth in the support of law and government. Dartmouth also told Gage that he would not be getting any more troops right then, but very helpfully, he was going to send the 3 new generals, which I'm sure is exactly what Gage wanted. One of them was William Howe, the other Henry Clinton, and the third John Burgoyne. The 3 of them sent out on the same ship to join Gage in Boston. And really, they were sent mostly to try to push Gage into some action. All 3 of these men would participate in the American Revolution and end it in sort of various states of disgrace. So Gage is under an awful lot of pressure to do something, to go out and do something about crushing these rebels. But Gage knew what would happen if he tried that. Remember, Gage was a veteran of the French and Indian War. He had fought with Americans. He knew what they were capable of, and he knew that a lot of the militiamen in Massachusetts at this time were veterans of the French and Indian War. These were not raw, untrained farmers. These were men who had fought, in serious combat and knew what they were doing. He understood that this was potentially a disaster, but at a certain point, there was nothing that he could do. He was just under so much pressure from London that he had to do something. So, of course, on April 19th, he sends his elite troops off to Concord to capture the military stores there. And as you folks very well know, they're met on Lexington Green, and essentially from this powder keg, it finally explodes into open warfare. And the Battle of Lexington and Concord takes place. The British are driven back into Boston and are basically laid siege. Here's a map of Boston circa 1775. I would suspect that there is no city in the United States that is more physically altered in the past 250 years than Boston. I mean, it's just unbelievable to look at it now. So many of these places that were islands that are now just all sort of part of the mainland. Of course, Boston at the time was essentially just an island itself, with just this little neck of land down by Roxbury connecting it to the mainland. So it's fairly easy to lay siege to it. So you've got this wild situation where in the course of a few days, this army of like 15,000 men just springs up out of nowhere. And the British army, which had previously control of all the countryside, is suddenly bottled up in Boston. And it's just amazing the speed with which this happens. And of course, none of this is planned. Nobody had thought about how this was going to work. It just happened. And as a result, there's no organization. There's no one sort of command structure. Nobody really even knew who was in charge of the army. Ostensibly, it was Massachusetts. But Massachusetts was writing to the Continental Congress saying, look, we can't handle this army. Please, please make it the Continental Army. It can't be the Massachusetts Army, 15,000 men. So again, there was no real understanding of who was in command. You had probably the one who was most in command, if you will, was Artemas Ward, who was commander-in-chief of the Massachusetts military. So he really was sort of in overall command. But you also had a number of other commanding officers from other colonies who didn't necessarily answer to Artemas Ward. One of them, of course, was Israel Putnam from Connecticut. Putnam was 57 years old, French and Indian War veteran, probably one of the most famous soldiers in America at the time, after, say, George Washington and some of those others. Putnam was very, very well known, real fire in the belly kind of guy, as opposed to Artemas Ward, who was not actually all that interested in taking risks. So Putnam is in command of Connecticut troops. He's not in command of Massachusetts troops. Artemas Ward is in command of Massachusetts troops, but he can't necessarily tell Putnam what to do. So you've got this very bizarre situation where this army has sprung up around the British in Boston with no real sort of understanding of who was in charge or what they were going to do or what they should do, really. But the Americans are feeling pretty good about their situation. They knew that they had the British largely outnumbered. They knew that they had them bottled up under siege in Boston. And there were a number of different skirmishes. There was one on Noddle Island and some of the other outlying islands. And the Americans actually managed to beat the British. They managed to burn a small British man-of-war. So the Americans are feeling pretty good about their situation. But they also understood that there was a strategic problem. And both the British and the Americans understood this. there are two points of high ground that commanded Boston at the time. One of them you can see to the south is Dorchester Heights. And you can see that sticking out sort of as a peninsula there, just south of Boston. Boston's the pink. And you can see Dorchester Heights below that. The hills in Dorchester Heights would command Boston Harbor if you had artillery there. So that was a very important strategic point. The other important strategic point was Charleston to the north of Boston, which was also a hilly country that could command the city. The difference being that guns in Charleston could actually fire into the city of Boston quite easily, as opposed to any guns that might be on Dorchester Heights. So both the Americans and the British understood that this high ground was crucial to maintaining control of the city, and they both wanted to capture it. The British were actually focused on Dorchester Heights, and they were making plans. They had actually laid plans to attack Dorchester Heights on June 18th and capture that high ground. Now, the Americans got wind of the British plans and recognized that they had to stop them. The Americans were more interested in Charleston than they were in Dorchester for a number of different reasons. And they realized that the best way to stop the British was to actually attack Charleston before the British took Dorchester Heights. So the decision was made to send troops to Charleston and entrench there to take control of the high ground and to command Boston with artillery. Now, it's not entirely clear, again, who was making this decision. It seemed to be the Committee of Safety from Massachusetts, who sent a very simple order that 1,200 men were to march to Charleston and entrench upon Bunker's Hill. That was the order. And here we see a map of Charleston with Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill. This command was given to William Prescott. Prescott was from Pepperell, Massachusetts. He was again a veteran of the French and Indian War, very, very talented soldier, so talented, in fact, that the British offered him a regular command, which is something they never even offered to George Washington. But he turned it down and preferred to go back to his farm in Massachusetts. Prescott was given command of these troops to go up to Charleston and entrench. It's not entirely clear how the decision was made as to where they would put the fortification. The orders were simply that they were to go and fortify on Bunker Hill. Of course, one of the great bits of trivia that every American knows is that the Battle of Bunker Hill was actually fought on Breed's Hill, which is sort of true, but again, like most of the stuff, is more complicated than that. There was at the time no place on Charleston known as Breed's Hill. There was Bunker Hill, and then there were a number of meadows, one of which was called Breed's Meadow. But some considered Bunker Hill to extend from where it is now, sort of all the way down to what we currently consider Breed's Hill. But the term Breed's Hill actually never appears in any of the writing until after the Battle of Bunker Hill. So it's not entirely clear what was meant. But when the troops marched on the night of June 18th to Charleston, three officers get together to discuss where they're going to put the fortification. And again, it is amazing how little we know about the Battle of Bunker Hill. We don't know exactly who those officers were. Certainly one of them had to have been William Prescott, since he was, one of the he was really the one in command of this. Uh, the second officer was most likely Israel Putnam. We don't know this, but Putnam, as I said, was a real fire in the belly kind of officer. And he inserted himself anywhere he could. Even if he had no business being there, he inserted himself. And it seems there's enough writing to suggest that Putnam was there. And it seems very likely that Putnam would have been the one advocating for where they were going to put the fortification. The problem with Bunker Hill is that guns on Bunker Hill couldn't necessarily reach Boston. It was too far north. If you put a fortification on Bunker Hill, the British could just ignore it. But if you put a fortification on Breed's Hill, well, that's really close to the city, and there's no way the British could ignore it. Guys like Putnam and probably Prescott were most interested in twisting the lion's tail. They wanted to get the British to come out of Boston and fight. And what better way than to put a fort right there where the British could not ignore it? And that seems to be the thinking behind the placement for the redoubt on Breed's Hill, that it was so close to the British that the British absolutely could not ignore it. So Prescott and Putnam and the engineer, a fellow named Gridley, decided to put the fortification on Breed's Hill. So they start digging on the night of June 18th. They dig all, or June 16th. They dig all through the night of the 16th, all through the 17th, throwing up this redoubt. The British are largely, are almost completely unaware of anything going on. Dawn breaks on the morning of June 17th, and lo and behold, there's a fortification on Breed's Hill with soldiers staring down at the city of Boston. Obviously, the British can't ignore that. They've got to do something about it. Now, one of the things that crops up in the Battle of Bunker Hill is, and as I said, there's an awful lot we don't know about it. We don't know who exactly made the decision to put the fortification where it was. One of the other questions that was debated for years and years after the battle was who was actually in command. And part of the question comes in because you had different areas of operation. So if you look at this map, you can see there is the redoubt, the fortification that was built on Breed's Hill. Directly to the north of that, if you can see it, there is it's labeled rail fence, and basically what it was just it was a rail fence. It was a wooden fence that ran from the crest of the hill down to the water. And then you also had Bunker Hill back there. So it seems that William Prescott, who was the only one who really was sort of officially charged with taking command on Bunker Hill, he had command of the fortification on Breed's Hill. That was his area of command. At the rail fence, you had John Stark, who was a New Hampshire officer, very crusty, very tough old bird. He came down. He was ordered to march to Bunker Hill, not told where to go. He shows up, looks around, sees this rail fence, and realizes, okay, this is the place where I should be. So he goes and lines his men up at the rail fence. Along with him is Thomas Knowlton, who was from Connecticut. He served with Israel Putnam. He also takes command at the rail fence. And then Joseph Warren, who ends up arriving after all the fortifications had been put in place, he was actually made Major General of the Massachusetts Army just a few days prior to Bunker Hill, which meant when he showed up, he outranked everybody there. And when he shows up, Israel Putnam says, okay, I'm willing to take orders from you. And Warren says, no, 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 no. I'm not going to give orders to you. You just tell me where to go. And this is the great thing about Joseph Warren. You had a lot of politicians who were very influential in the political realm, guys like, John Adams. You had soldiers like George Washington or Henry Knox who were very good at the military part. Joseph Warren was one of the only characters in the American Revolution who was an effective politician, very important politician. But boy, when the shooting started, he rode to the sound of the guns. And you saw that again and again. Lexington and Concord, he was there. All the skirmishes that happened around Boston, he always showed up ready to fight. So he shows up at Bunker Hill, ready to fight, musket in hand. Israel Putnam, who had no official command at the Battle of Bunker Hill, seems to have been everywhere. So he's on Bunker Hill, sending troops over to the redoubt or sending them down to the rail fence. He's riding down to the rail fence, giving them encouragement. He's, trying to organize supplies and more reinforcements. Warren shows up. Putnam says, just go to the redoubt, see what you can do there. Warren shows up at the redoubt, and once again, Prescott, who is in charge of the redoubt, recognizes that Warren outranks him and says, "Okay, well, what do you want me to do?" And Warren says, "No, no, I'm not gonna give you orders. You tell me what to do." So Warren basically just takes his place with the other men at the wall, musket in hand. Meanwhile, the British recognize that there's something that they have got to do to drive the Americans out. They cannot just ignore this fortification that has cropped up on Bunker Hill. Excuse me. The sun seems to be setting and illuminating me. Okay. There we go. All right, that might be better. Anyway, so Gage gives William Howe command of the British troops in Boston to attack Charleston and basically drive the rebels out of the redoubt that they've created. It takes 10 hours for the British to organize their men, organize the boats to bring them from Boston over to Charleston, where they could launch an attack. Incredibly, in that 10 hours, Howe never bothers to reconnoiter what he's looking at. He never sends a boat around the north side of Charleston to see what the American troops are doing on the other side. They couldn't even tell if what they were looking at was an actual redoubt or if it was just a wall. They had absolutely no idea what they were up against. And for 10 hours, they never bothered to find out. It really is an extraordinary degree of negligence on the part of William Howe. So finally, after 10 hours, they load the troops up, they bring them over, and they land them on the eastern point of Charleston by Molten Hill. And it's only then that Howe comes ashore and he realizes, oh, this is actually a full redoubt. And not only is it a full redoubt, but he's got this rail fence that he's facing with all of these Americans behind it, entrenched behind it. And they've been building up the defenses, for 10 hours now. Howe realizes that he doesn't have enough men. So he sends back to Boston for reinforcements. So again, they're waiting around for more British troops to come over as the Americans continue to entrench and continue to strengthen their lines as best they can. Now, Howe's plan had always been to march around the northeast side of the redoubt and come in behind the Americans with one column, while his second in command, a fellow named Piggott, goes up Breeds Hill from the southern side. So you get a two-pronged attack on this redoubt on Breeds Hill. When Howe comes ashore and he sees this rail fence, he realizes that he can't do that because now he's got all these Americans right on his flank. So he gets more um, troops over, lines them up, and launches an attack against the rail fence. And his grenadiers and his light companies move forward um, along the shoreline there toward the rail fence. And the Americans, in an absolutely incredible display of discipline, hold their fire as these British troops are marching towards them. This is the famous Israel Putnam command of don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. The Americans hold off and they hold off. Again, with just amazing discipline for these men who, many of whom had never been under fire before. They wait until the British troops get within 50 feet of them, and then they just absolutely unload with just a withering wall of fire straight into the British troops. The British are devastated. They're absolutely mowed down as they come in a way that they had absolutely not anticipated. And even the experienced officers had never seen anything like this. And these are the elite British troops. These are the grenadiers of the light infantry, and they are stopped in their tracks. They can't go forward. They're paralyzed. They're hung up as more troops are coming up behind them. Finally, they break and run. And the Americans are astounded. Here are the grenadiers and the light infantry breaking and running from American fire. It was an amazing moment. At the same time, Howe's other column is going up Breeds Hill and marching toward the redoubt. And once again, the Americans do the same thing. They hold their fire with amazing discipline until the redcoats are right on top of them, and then they let loose with an absolute devastating volley that drives the British troops back. Twice, Howe and Piggott are forced back, where they regroup and attack once again. And twice, the Americans have the fire discipline to hold off until the redcoats are right on top of them and then let them have it. They drive them back again. It is absolutely astounding discipline and just, heroics for these men. Again, many of whom who had never been under fire before. Howe realizes that this tactic is not going to work. And he reorganizes his men and he sends them up, not at the rail fence, but sort of at an angle up the hill. The Americans are essentially out of ammunition at this point. As the British storm up over the redoubt, the Americans are literally throwing rocks at them because they've got nothing left. Finally, the British are able to come up over the redoubt and drive the Americans out. It's an absolute rout as the Americans just run for their lives. In the very last moments of the battle, Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the last men out of the redoubt, is shot and killed. This, of course, is a very romantic painting of the death of Joseph Warren. It looked nothing like that. In fact, people didn't even know that Warren had been killed in the battle. It's only some days later that they realized in all the confusion that Warren was one of the casualties. But the Americans are driven out off of Bunker Hill. The British take control of it, and they hold Charleston for the rest of the time that they're in Boston. But it is a Pyrrhic victory. The British suffer 50% casualties in Bunker Hill, and it is an absolute disaster from their point of view. Gage, who really did not deserve responsibility for the disaster. It really should have gone to William Howe, but Gage is blamed for the disaster, and he's recalled as the end of his military career. Howe goes on to become commander in chief in North America, but he never forgot the lesson that he learned at Bunker Hill, and he never again made the mistake of attacking entrenched Americans, thinking that they were just going to throw their arms away and run because they were just a disreputable rabble of farmers. So that's the Battle of Bunker Hill, and some of the aftermath. If anyone has any questions, I would love to make something up.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Jim. I'm sure there are questions. So we'll start with questions here in the room, and Matt will handle questions from Zoom. Let me see. I think Phil had his hand up first. You're going to be second. Okay. Maybe, do we have another mic? Jim, you're going to help me. You take that side of the room.
Now, bear in mind that I wrote this book 13 years ago, so.
Hello. I heard the Patriots ran out of ammunition, and someone was speaking. I heard a number like 39,000 rounds have been expended, which makes it much more than a lunchbox full of bullets. Any idea of how many rounds the Americans had to fire?
Boy, I don't. But I can say that it varied. Again, because there was no. This is all very ad hoc, and every unit was supplying their own ammunition. One of the problems the Americans had, for folks who are familiar with 18th century firearms, a musket ideally is fired with a cartridge. You've got a paper cartridge with the bullet and the gunpowder in it, and you bite the end of the cartridge off and you pour the gunpowder down the barrel and you put the bullet down, and it makes for very quick loading. The Americans didn't have that. They mostly just had their powder and powder horns and loose bullets, which meant they couldn't load nearly as quickly as the British could. And again, you have reports of, as these units were sent off to Bunker Hill, the men would line up and they'd be given like their little container of powder, and I know in one case each man was given 15 bullets, and that was it. So I've never heard a number as to how many rounds were expended, but it certainly is the case that it differed per unit. And one of the things, again, because it was so poorly organized, the Americans, when they were sent to Bunker Hill, kept expecting supplies to show up. They expected food and water and ammunition, and nothing was ever sent to them. They really started to think that they were being abandoned up there because they never got any kind of resupplies. So it's kind of a long-winded answer to long-winded way of saying, I'm afraid I don't know.
All right, next.
To what extent did the minute companies, I'm just thinking the French and Indian War, which was what, 20 years before this happened?
Well, it ended in more like 10, 12 years. And the French and Indian War ended in 1763.
Okay, I just wondered the organization or whatever militia there was from the French and Indian War, to what extent did that help prepare the colonists to fight at Bunker Hill in terms of command, in terms of equipage, in terms of just basic warfare? Did that experience help prepare?
It helped a great deal, yes. And you can see when you look at the demographics of the men who fought at Lexington and Concord and the men who fought at Bunker Hill, they were on average much older than the soldiers who would fight later in the Revolution. because they were militia, and they were largely veterans of the French and Indian War. Um, so they did have that discipline, they did have that training. Uh, but they were also, because they were older, they had families, they had farms. So as the war dragged on, those folks sort of backed off and let the 17, 18-year-old guys come in and take over as the full-time soldiers. But at Lexington and Concord and at Bunker Hill, you had a pretty high percentage of French and Indian War veterans, which is one of the reasons that you see that fire discipline, for instance, and you see in a lot of cases a performance far beyond what the Redcoats would have thought the Americans were capable of. So I don't know in terms of organization, it might have made a big difference on the local level, just in terms of the local militias organizing themselves. But I think in terms of training and experience, that F&I history actually made a very big difference.
Okay, Jim.
Oh, do we have a question from this side? Yes.
Yes, a question about the Americans and their ammunition. What is known about the supply of ammunition for the colonials? Was this still dependent on European imports, or was there an indigenous industry for gunpowder and lead?
Excellent question. I don't know about where the lead was coming from, but certainly manufacturing gunpowder is not all that difficult, and making lead balls is not very difficult at all. So I think, and of course, one of the problems that you have is that most of these guys at this point in the war are just bringing the muskets that they have at home. So they're all different calibers, and there's no sort of standardization among the weapons. I think that undoubtedly each individual man or each militia company were casting their own bullets, and I think that there was a domestic gunpowder manufacturing. Certainly, the Americans couldn't manufacture enough, and gunpowder was always a huge problem, particularly in those early days of the war. When George Washington takes over in Cambridge, he's absolutely shocked to find how little gunpowder there is, and he's desperately seeking it anywhere he can find it, including sending ships to Bermuda to try to get it there. So I think they were making gunpowder in America. They couldn't make that much. I think certainly imports were, whatever imports they could get, they were eager to get.
Okay, next, Bill.
Among the British, Thomas Gage got the blame. Who among the Americans got blame or credit for Bunker Hill?
Boy, it's interesting because on the one hand, it was a defeat, and people weren't all that eager to talk about it. But I think on the command level, it was understood that people like Prescott was a serious hero. He really did an excellent job with what he had. In terms of court martials and that sort of thing, there was only about 4 of them, and they were fairly minor characters. There were a couple of artillerymen who were court-martialed. A few others were court-martialed for cowardice. But there doesn't seem to be any serious blame that was doled out. Artemus Ward, who was in command of the troops, has certainly been blamed for not sending reinforcements, for not sending supplies. But to a large extent, that was just sort of a breakdown in communication. And of course, Ward was very concerned that the British, while all this was going on at Bunker Hill, the British were going to be sending troops overland and attacking his other flank. So he wasn't so eager to necessarily devote all the resources to Bunker Hill. So I think the whole thing was kind of viewed as a debacle, but for the most part, there wasn't any one person who came in for any real blame. And a lot of people like Stark and Knowlton and Warren and Putnam were actually considered to be heroes of that day.
Thank you.
How many British troops did they send to Charlestown, number one? And number two, was there any thought of trying to deny them the landing at Charlestown? It seems like they've been pretty vulnerable trying to get out of rowboats and ships.
Yeah. Okay. I think there were about 2,500 British troops that were ultimately sent. More were sent in the very last sort of half hour of the battle, but they didn't really end up doing much of anything. But there were about 2,500 British troops who were engaged, as opposed to, it's very hard to estimate the American troops, particularly because as the battle wore on, more and more people started showing up. But there's probably about 1,500 to 2,000 Americans engaged. There was no effort to oppose the landing, which would seem to be a natural thing. But the Americans, first off, they didn't really have much artillery at all. So they couldn't use artillery to oppose the landing. And they sure as heck were not going to leave their redoubt and go down and start trying to fight the British on open ground. So no, there really wasn't much they could do. Also, as soon as dawn came and they saw that this redoubt had been built, all the men of war in around Charleston, all the British naval vessels opened fire on them. So there was a continuous bombardment all day long. I mean, really right up until the point where there was a potential of hitting British soldiers. The British ships didn't let up. So leaving the redoubt to go down and try to oppose the landing could have been a real bloody mess given the amount of iron that was flying through the air at the time. So no, there was no effort to oppose the landing.
Okay, Sue, next.
One of the Redcoat leaders in Lexington was Major John Pitcairn.
Mhm.
I understand he was the commander of the 3rd Assault. Can you tell us what happened to him?
Yes, he was a Marine commander, commanded the Marines. A very, very brave officer, of course, played a crucial role in the Battle of Lexington and Concord. He was very well loved and very well respected by his men. And he was leading the 3rd Assault. He was with Pigot's men on the south side of the redoubt, going up Breed's Hill to do the frontal assault against the redoubt. And he leads the men right up until the very last moment. I think he may have actually been climbing the walls when he was shot down. His son was at his side. He wasn't killed immediately, and his son carried his body off the field, and he was actually transported back to Boston, where he died. But he was considered one of the real great losses on the British side because he was such a competent officer and so well loved by his men.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. So get your question in, sir. You have one?
What is a redoubt and why do they call it a redoubt?
Sorry.
Great question.
Yeah, right. A redoubt is just an earthen wall, basically. In this case, I think it's, I don't know this for sure, but I think it is it's actually not just an earthen wall. I believe it's an enclosed earthen structure, basically like an earth fortification. And where the term comes from, I'm afraid I do not know.
Well, at least now we know, everybody knows what it is, if you didn't before. Are there any more questions? Last chance.
Is there any on Zoom? I guess nothing on Zoom.
No, Matt says the Zoom audience is relatively placid today. All right, by the way, there were several questions about the arms and ammunition used. You might be interested to know that in April, our program is going to be about the arms and ammunition used in the Revolutionary War. We have an expert who goes out to this day and conducts shooting tests and all kinds of technical tests. And he knows all about what is used, its capabilities, its capacities on both sides. And he will talk about the weapons and their capabilities. So stay tuned. All right, please, let's give a big hand to Jim.
Thank you.
All right, we thank Jim Nelson very much. This was
Thank
great.
you. Thank you for having me.
This was wonderful, gave us a new understanding of Bunker Hill. You can tell by the questions, by the number of them, and don't we have an intelligent, aware, curious audience? We do. So we thank you very much, everybody, for venturing out in the aftermath of the storm. This concludes our program. We hope to see you next month on the 12th of February. Thank you for coming, and good afternoon.